Hello there, how are you tonight? Imagine waking up at the very top of the world, power in your hands, an empire at your command, and thousands of people waiting for your decisions, but something feels off, because the higher you rise, the quieter things become. Conversations stop when you enter, smiles feel slightly forced, and even the people closest to you seem harder to read. You walk through grand halls of marble and gold, surrounded by guards, advisors, servants, and yet, there's a strange feeling that you are completely alone, because in this world, power doesn't just protect you, it separates you, and slowly, you begin to realize something unsettling. Not everyone around you is truly loyal. Some are watching, some are waiting, and some may already be planning something you cannot see. Before we step deeper into this world, take a moment to gently like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these calm journeys, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always a little fascinating seeing how far these quiet stories travel. Now, let's step slowly into ancient Rome and experience what it was really like to be a Roman emperor. The morning begins quietly, not with noise, not with urgency, but with stillness. A pale light slips through tall, narrow windows, brushing softly across polished marble floors. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of oil lamps that burn through the night. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain trickles, steady, calm, almost hypnotic. You open your eyes slowly, for a brief moment. Just a fleeting second. There is peace, no titles, no expectations, no empire, just you, lying beneath finely woven linen, listening to the soft rhythm of your own breath. But it never lasts, because reality arrives. Gently, but firmly, a quiet movement near the doorway. Sandaled feet shifting against stone. The almost silent presence of someone waiting. They never knock loudly, no one dares to. A servant stands just beyond the threshold, head lowered, waiting for the smallest signal that you are awake. They have been there for some time now. Perhaps minutes. Perhaps longer. You do not ask, you already know. Slowly, you sit up. The room around you is vast, far larger than any space meant for a single person. High ceilings stretch above, painted with fading scenes of gods and victories. Columns rise like silent watchers, carved with delicate precision. Everything here speaks of power, of permanence, and yet none of it feels warm. As your feet touch the cold floor, another servant steps forward. Then another. They move with quiet coordination, careful not to disturb the stillness more than necessary. No one meets your eyes, not directly. There is respect. Yes. But beneath it, something else. Something harder to define. Caution. You are handed a robe, soft, heavy, embroidered with threads that shimmer faintly in the morning light. It settles on your shoulders like a reminder of who you are, of what you are expected to be. Outside your chamber, the palace is already awake, not loudly, not chaotically, but with a controlled, deliberate energy. Footsteps echo faintly in distant corridors. Voices murmur behind walls. Messages are being carried. Decisions are waiting, always waiting. As you begin to walk, guards fall into place around you without a word. Their armor catches the light in small flashes, subtle but constant. Their presence is both protective and suffocating. They are here to keep you safe, but also to ensure you are never truly alone. The corridor stretches ahead, long and gleaming. Each step echoes slightly, reminding you just how empty it feels despite the many people within it. Statues line the walls, past rulers, frozen in stone. Their expressions are calm, composed, almost distant. You wonder, briefly, if they ever felt this same quiet weight pressing against their chest, if they, too, walked these halls, aware that every movement was observed, every word remembered. A servant approaches carefully, holding a small tray. Fresh fruit, bread, a cup of watered wine. Breakfast, simple, but precise. You take a bite, it tastes fine, but you barely notice, because your mind is already moving ahead, drifting toward the day that waits beyond these walls. Petitions, reports, decisions, each one small on its own, yet together, shaping the lives of thousands, millions, and all of it rests with you. As you continue walking, a set of large doors comes into view. Beyond them lies the heart of the palace, where the world begins to press closer, louder, more demanding. But here, in this quiet moment, there is still a fragile sense of distance. You pause, just for a second, listening to the faint echo of water, to the distant hum of a waking empire, to the subtle tension that never quite leaves your chest. This is how your day begins, not with chaos, not with command, but with silence, a silence that feels almost peaceful, until you realize it isn't empty, it's waiting. The morning does not truly begin. When you open your eyes, it begins. When the world begins to reach for you, even before you rise. Before your feet touch the cold marble. Before a single word is spoken, the empire is already awake, waiting. You sit there for a moment longer than necessary, not out of laziness, but hesitation, because once you stand, the quiet disappears, and in its place comes everything. A soft rustle at the doorway reminds you that time has already started moving without you. You do not call them in, they enter anyway, carefully, respectfully, almost silently. A servant carries fresh garments. Another holds a basin of water. A third waits with folded cloth. Eyes lowered. Posture still, they move like shadows. Rehearsed, precise. Never colliding, never speaking unless spoken to. You allow them to approach. Cool water brushes against your hands. It is refreshing, grounding, but brief. Everything here is brief, because there is always something next. As they dress you, layer by layer, the fabric grows heavier. Not physically, not entirely, but symbolically. Each fold, each fastening, each adjustment, a reminder, you are no longer just a man, you are the center of something vast. Something restless. Something that never truly sleeps, and it expects you to keep it steady. By the time the final layer settles on your shoulders, you can already feel it, the day pressing in. A messenger waits, of course he does. There is always one, standing at a careful distance, scroll held firmly but not tightly, as if even the parchment must show restraint in your presence. He does not speak immediately, no one does. They wait for permission. You nod. He steps forward, just enough to present the scroll. Never enough to seem familiar. You take it. The seal is already broken, because someone has read it before you. They always do. You unroll it slowly. Your eyes move across the lines, absorbing details that, to most, would seem distant. A dispute between officials in a far province, a delay in grain shipments, a quiet concern about unrest. Not yet a problem, but something to watch. Small things, at least. They seem small, but here, you understand something others do not. Nothing is ever just small, because small things grow. Left alone, they become questions, then problems, then consequences, and eventually blame, which always finds its way back to you. you hand the scroll back without comment, not because you have no thoughts, but because you are already thinking too many. Another scroll is offered, then another, each one a piece of a larger pattern, a pattern only you are expected to see. As you move from your chamber into the wider halls, the palace feels different now, less quiet, not louder, but heavier. The silence is no longer empty, it is filled with expectation. People step aside as you pass, some bow slightly, others lower their gaze, a few attempt to smile, but you've begun to notice something. They never hold it for long, because when you carry absolute power, people do not relax around you, they adjust. Carefully. Constantly, every word they choose, every gesture they make, every silence they keep, measured. You walk past a series of tall windows. Outside, the city stretches endlessly. Rooftops, temples, narrow streets slowly filling with life. From here, it looks peaceful, almost simple, but you know better, because every one of those streets holds lives that can be changed by a single decision you make today, and many of those people will never know your name beyond the title, yet they will feel you, in laws, in taxes, in protection, or the lack of it. Power is strange like that. You do not need to be seen to be present everywhere. A breeze slips through the corridor, light and cool, for a moment. It almost feels normal, like something untouched by expectation. You pause again, briefly, looking out across the city. This is what it means to wake up with absolute power, not control, not comfort, but awareness, constant, unending awareness that everything is connected to you, and you are connected to everything. Behind you, footsteps approach quietly, not rushed. Never rushed. There is always time. When you are waiting for the emperor, another voice speaks, low and careful. More matters require your attention. Of course they do. They always will. You turn slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge, and in that small movement, the day truly begins, because now, you are no longer waking up, you are deciding, and somewhere far beyond these walls, the consequences have already started. By now, the day has fully taken hold. There is no gentle beginning anymore. No quiet pause between moments. Everything moves. Even when you stand still, you find yourself seated, though you do not remember the moment you chose to sit. A high-backed chair, carved, polished, positioned carefully within a vast chamber designed not just for comfort, but for presence, for authority, for distance. The space around you is deliberate, wide, open, impossible to cross casually. No one approaches without intention, and certainly not without permission. Before you, the room stretches outward in measured symmetry. Marble floors, smooth and cool, reflect the filtered light from above. Tall columns rise like silent guardians, framing the space in quiet precision. It is beautiful, impressive, and strangely isolating, because in a place like this, every step toward you feels significant, every voice slightly restrained. The first figure approaches, an official, carefully dressed, carefully composed. He bows. Just enough, not too deeply, not too casually. Even respect has a balance here. He begins to speak, measured words, calm tone, clear intention, but as he talks, you notice something beyond the content. Hesitation, not in what he says, but in how he says it. A subtle pause before certain phrases, a slight shift in posture, a careful avoidance of anything that might sound too direct. You listen, of course you do, but beneath the surface of his message, another layer forms. Not just information, but interpretation, because you are not only hearing facts, you are hearing what people choose to show you, and slowly, You begin to understand something heavier than authority itself. You may hold power over everyone in this room, but you do not hold complete truth. The realization is quiet, but it settles deeply. Another official steps forward, then another. Each one brings something different, a request, a concern, a suggestion. Carefully framed to sound agreeable, they do not argue, not openly. Disagreement exists. But it is softened, shaped into something more acceptable, because here, in your presence, no one wants to be remembered as the one who spoke too boldly. Or worse, the one who spoke against you, and so you begin to carry something unexpected, not just decisions, but doubt, because when every voice is careful, how do you know which one is honest? The chamber remains calm. There are no raised voices, no visible tension, and yet the air feels thick, not with noise, but with restraint. You shift slightly in your seat. The movement is small, almost unnoticeable, but it changes everything. Conversations pause, eyes adjust, attention sharpens. It is a simple reminder of what your presence does to a room. You do not need to speak loudly. You do not need to command. Your existence here is enough, and that carries its own kind of weight. A scroll is placed before you, another matter requiring judgment. You glance at it briefly, then longer. The details unfold slowly. Two sides, two perspectives, both reasonable, both flawed, both expecting something from you, a decision, final, unquestioned. You feel it again, that quiet pressure building. Not around you, but within you, because every choice, no matter how small it appears, will ripple outward. A single judgment today could reshape relationships, influence loyalties, alter futures, and once it is made, it cannot be taken back. You rest your hand against the arm of the chair. The stone beneath feels solid, unmoving, unlike everything else. For a moment, you allow yourself to breathe, slowly, deliberately, but even that feels observed. Nothing you do is ever entirely private. Finally, you speak. Your voice is calm, even, carefully measured. Just like theirs, the decision leaves your lips. Simple, direct. It feels smaller than it should. But the moment it lands, you see it, the shift, subtle but undeniable. Postures adjust, eyes flicker. A quiet chain reaction passing through the room, because your words are no longer just words, they are outcomes, and outcomes have weight. The officials step back, one by one, their roles fulfilled. For now, but not finished, never finished. As the room begins to empty, the silence returns, but it is different now, heavier, full of everything that has just occurred. And everything still waiting. You lean back slightly, not in comfort, but in awareness. This is what it means to carry the weight of being emperor, not the crown, not the throne, but the constant knowing that every moment matters, that every silence is noticed, that every decision becomes something real for someone else. And the most unsettling part is not the responsibility, it is the realization that no matter how much power you hold, you can never be completely certain that you are right. Outside, the day continues, uninterrupted, unaware, but here, within these walls, the weight never lifts, it only shifts from one moment to the next. The palace never truly rests, even when it seems quiet. Even when the corridors fall into long stretches of stillness, there is always something moving beneath the surface, a door closing softly in the distance, footsteps echoing briefly, then fading, voices carried just enough to remind you that you are never alone here, and yet, it often feels like you are. As the day unfolds, you begin to notice something subtle, something easy to miss at first. The palace is not just a place, it is a world, a carefully structured endlessly shifting world. With its own rhythms, its own rules, and its own quiet tensions, you walk through a series of inner corridors, far from the grand public halls. Here, the architecture changes, the ceilings lower slightly. The spaces narrow. The decorations, while still elegant, feel more intimate, more controlled. This is where life inside the palace truly happens, not in the vast chambers designed for display, but in these quieter spaces, where people speak more freely, or at least believe they do. Servants pass by in soft patterns, moving with purpose but never urgency. They carry linens, trays, sealed messages, small pieces of a much larger system. Each one knows their role, each one understands where they stand. No one lingers too long, because lingering invites attention, and attention is something most here prefer to avoid. As you continue walking, you pass an open courtyard. Sunlight pours in gently, illuminating a small fountain at its center. The sound of water is soft, steady, almost calming. For a moment, it feels different, less controlled, a glimpse of something natural. Within a place that is anything but, a few figures stand at the edges of the courtyard. They notice you immediately. Conversation stop, not abruptly, but smoothly, as if they had already been preparing for it. You do not interrupt, you simply observe, because over time, you have learned something important. What people say when they know you are present is rarely what they truly think. You move on, deeper into the palace. The air shifts slightly, cooler, stiller. You pass a set of closed doors. Behind them, quiet laughter, soft, restrained, but unmistakable. It lingers for just a moment, then disappears. You do not stop, but the sound stays with you, because it reminds you of something distant, something almost forgotten. Ease, not the absence of responsibility, but the absence of awareness, the ability to exist without being watched. That feeling does not live here. Further ahead, you encounter a group of attendants preparing a room. They move quickly, adjusting fabrics, placing objects with precise care. Everything must be correct, everything must appear effortless, even though it never is. They step aside as you approach, heads lowered, movement synchronized. It is not fear, not entirely, but it is not comfort either. It is something in between. A constant awareness of who you are and what that means for them. You pause briefly, looking at the room, at the details, at the effort behind something that, to others, will seem simple, and you begin to understand something deeper about this place. The palace is built on more than stone and marble. It is built on perception, on control, on the careful shaping of how everything appears, and how little of what is real is ever fully shown. As you continue, the corridors open again into a larger hall. More people now, more movement, advisors crossing paths, messengers arriving and departing, guards maintaining their silent watch. It feels alive, but not in a natural way, more like a system, precise, constant, unforgiving. Everyone here is part of something. And yet, no one seems entirely at ease within it. You pass by a polished bronze mirror mounted along the wall. For a brief moment, you catch your reflection, still, composed, unreadable, exactly as it should be, and yet, you hesitate, because you realize something quietly unsettling. Even you have become part of the palace, not separate from it, not above it, but within it, shaped by it, defined by it. The way you move, the way you speak, the way you are seen, all of it influenced by these walls, by the people within them, by the constant, unspoken understanding that nothing here is ever entirely simple. As the day continues, you find yourself returning to the grander sections of the palace, the spaces where appearances matter most, where the world outside is allowed to look in. just enough to believe in what it sees, but now something has changed, slightly. You no longer see the palace as a place of power alone, you see it as something more complex, a place where every interaction carries meaning, where every silence hides something, where every person is navigating a delicate balance between duty, survival, and something unspoken. And as you walk forward, surrounded by all of it, you begin to feel something quietly settling in, a realization. The palace does not simply belong to you. In many ways, you belong to it. By now, the palace no longer feels unfamiliar, but it does not feel comfortable either. You walk slowly. Not because you must, but because everything here seems to demand a certain pace, measured, controlled, observed. The corridors stretch endlessly. Polished marble beneath your feet reflecting faint light from above. Gold accents shimmer softly along the walls. Not bright or overwhelming, but constant, a quiet reminder of wealth, of power, of expectation. Your footsteps echo gently, not loud. Never loud, but enough to follow you, as if the palace itself is listening. You pass between towering columns, each carved with intricate detail. Scenes of victories, gods, emperors of the past. Frozen in moments of triumph, they watch you, not truly. But it feels that way, because every face carved into stone seems calm. Certain. Unburdened, very different from how it feels to stand here now. A pair of guards shift slightly as you approach, their posture sharpens. Movement subtle but precise, they do not speak, they do not need to. Their presence alone carries a message. You are being watched, always, even in silence. As you continue walking, the corridor opens into a grand gallery, light spills in from above. Soft and diffused, touching polished surfaces and golden trims with a quiet glow. Statues line both sides, marble figures. Lifelike and still, some of them. You recognize past rulers, men who once stood where you stand now, men who held the same power, made the same decisions, carried the same unseen weight. You slow your pace, just slightly. Your eyes linger on one statue in particular. Its expression is calm, composed, almost distant. There is no sign of doubt, no trace of hesitation, only certainty. But you know better, because you are living what that statue can never show. The uncertainty behind every decision, the silence after every command, the quiet question that follows even the most confident choice. Did you choose correctly? The gallery continues. Long and symmetrical, beautiful, but repetitive. Every step forward feels the same as the last, as if movement itself changes nothing. The servant appears from a side passage, carrying a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. They stop immediately upon seeing you. Head lowered, hand steady. But not entirely. You pause, not out of necessity, but curiosity. They step forward slowly, offering the object without a word. You take it. The cloth is soft, worn slightly at the edges. Inside, something simple, a small carved figure, unremarkable compared to everything around you, and yet it feels different, not made for display, not made to impress, made by hand. For a moment, the palace fades, just slightly. You hand it back. The servant withdraws. Quietly, quickly, disappearing into the corridor as if they were never there. And just like that, the moment is gone. You continue walking. The marble, the gold, the endless symmetry returns, as if nothing had interrupted it. But something has changed. Subtly, you begin to notice how perfect everything is, too perfect. Every surface polished, every object placed with intention, every space designed to create a feeling rather than reflect reality. There are no rough edges here, no imperfections, no signs of life as it truly is, only what it is meant to appear as, and you begin to understand something quietly unsettling. This place is not built to reflect truth, it is built to control perception. You reach the end of the gallery. Another set of doors waits ahead, large, ornate, closed. Beyond them, more rooms, more people, more expectations. You stop again, just for a moment. Looking back, the long corridor stretches behind you. Unchanged. Silent. Endless. It looks the same as it did before, but it feels different now. Heavier, not because of what is there, but because of what is not. Honesty, ease, simplicity. You turn forward again, because there is no other direction to go. And as your hand moves toward the door, you realize something quietly, deeply true. In a world built of marble and gold, it is not the weight of the materials that burdens you, it is the illusion they create. You begin to notice something subtle. It is not the architecture, not the halls, not even the silence between rooms. It is the people. The palace is never empty, but it is also never truly full. It exists somewhere in between. Filled with presence, yet lacking openness. Everywhere you go, there are figures moving with purpose, servants who appear and disappear like quiet thoughts, guards who remain still for so long they begin to feel like part of the stone, officials who travel in small groups, speaking only when necessary. And even then, carefully, each of them has a role, each of them understands exactly where they belong, and you exist at the center of all of it. Not because you chose it, but because everything else bends toward that position. As you walk through another corridor, you pass two servants speaking softly. Their voices stop the moment they notice you, not abruptly, but naturally. Like a candle being gently covered, they bow their heads and continue on their way in silence. You do not acknowledge them, not out of disregard, but because acknowledgement itself carries weight here, and weight is something everyone already carries enough of. Further ahead, a group of advisors stand near a columned archway. They are speaking before you arrive, but as soon as you enter their line of sight, the conversation shifts, not fully stopping, but reshaping itself. Words become more measured, gestures become smaller, opinions become safer. You realize something you have not fully noticed before. People do not speak freely here, they speak strategically, even in casual moments, even in passing. There is calculation, not always fear, sometimes respect, sometimes survival, often all of it mixed together. A guard steps slightly closer as you pass, not blocking, not following too closely, just enough to remind you and everyone else that distance is never accidental. You continue walking, through arches, across courtyards, past doors that lead to places you rarely enter directly. Each space has its own atmosphere. Some feel formal, some feel quieter, some feel almost human, but none of them feel entirely separate from the same invisible structure, because the palace is not just made of rooms, it is made of relationships, connections that are not always spoken aloud, but always understood. You pass a small group of attendants carrying scrolls and sealed letters. They move quickly, but carefully. One of them glances up for just a moment, their eyes meet yours, and then immediately drop again. It lasts less than a second, but it stays with you longer than expected, because even that brief moment carries meaning here. Everything does. As you step into a wider courtyard, the sky opens above you, soft light falls across stone pathways and trimmed greenery. For a moment, it feels less enclosed, more open, but the presence of people remains, always at the edges, always aware. You see a senior advisor standing alone near a fountain, not waiting, not rushing, just standing, as if thinking. As you approach, they turn slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge you without interrupting whatever thought they were carrying. You stop beside them. Silence settles between you, not uncomfortable, not peaceful, just present. After a moment, they speak, carefully, choosing words like stepping stones across water. Nothing unnecessary, nothing too direct, yet everything important still arrives. You listen, and as you do, you begin to understand something deeper. The people around you are not simply individuals moving through the palace, they are reflections of structure, of expectation, of what the palace requires them to be. Some are loyal because they believe in what they serve, some because they fear what happens if they do not, some because they have simply never known anything else, and most are somewhere in between. You nod slightly, a signal that the conversation may end. It does, respectfully, naturally. The advisor steps back and continues their path, disappearing into the flow of the courtyard. You remain for a moment longer, watching the movement around you, people crossing paths, voices rising and fading, small interactions happening constantly. None of them truly random, and yet none of them fully transparent either. You realize then that your presence does not simply influence the people around you, it reshapes them. Even when you are not speaking, even when you are not acting, they adjust, not always consciously, but consistently, as if your existence creates a quiet pressure in the air itself. You turn away from the courtyard, and as you continue walking, one thought begins to settle in more clearly than before. You are not surrounded by strangers. You are surrounded by roles, and every role here exists in relation to you, not equally, not freely, but carefully positioned, like pieces in a system that never stops moving. And the most unsettling part is not that they watch you. It is that they have learned how to exist around being watched. There is a strange shift that happens when trust becomes rare. You begin to notice things others do not. A pause before someone answers, a glance that lasts half a second too long, a sentence that feels carefully shaped rather than naturally spoken. At first, you try to ignore it, because suspicion is exhausting, but in a place like this, it never fully disappears. It simply becomes part of how you see the world. The palace, once again, is quiet this morning, not empty, never empty, but controlled in its stillness. You walk through a narrow hall lined with tall windows. Soft light spills in, stretching across marble floors like pale water. Outside, the city continues its distant life. Unaware of the small calculations happening within these walls, inside, however, every interaction feels measured. You pass a group of attendants speaking in low tones. They stop immediately when they notice you, not out of fear alone, but out of habit, a learned silence. They bow slightly and continue on their way without delay. No one lingers near you longer than necessary unless required, and even then, there is always distance, physical, emotional, invisible. Further ahead, you encounter two advisors standing near a column. They are not speaking when you arrive, but something in their posture suggests they were just discussing something important, something that does not continue once you appear. One of them steps forward, carefully, respectfully. Their voice is calm as they present a matter requiring attention, but as they speak, you notice what is not said. Entire thoughts are missing, certain details softened, some phrases replaced with safer ones. You listen without interruption, not because you accept everything, but because you are learning how everything is shaped before it reaches you. After they finish, silence returns, the kind that feels deliberate. You look between them, just briefly, and in that small moment, something passes, not spoken, not confirmed, but understood. They are watching your reaction more than they are listening for approval. You realize then that trust here is not a simple choice, it is a constant negotiation, something never fully granted, only adjusted. You move on, through another corridor. The palace shifts around you like a living structure, rooms connected not just by stone, but by intention. Every hallway leads somewhere, but also away from somewhere else. You pass a messenger holding sealed correspondence. He does not slow down, but his grip tightens slightly as you pass, a subtle reaction, almost imperceptible, but not to you. You notice it, and you wonder, briefly, what thought crossed his mind in that moment. Was it loyalty, fear, or something more complicated? you continue walking, eventually reaching a quieter section of the palace, less movement here, fewer voices, more space between people, and in that space, something else appears, awareness. A senior figure stands alone near a window overlooking the courtyard below. They do not turn immediately when you approach. Only after a pause, carefully timed, respectfully delayed, they speak when you allow it, and their words are different, not entirely honest, but less shaped than others, more direct, more personal, still careful, but closer to truth. You listen, and as you do, you begin to understand something uncomfortable. Trust in this place is not absent because people are disloyal, it is absent because truth itself is dangerous. Every statement carries risk, every opinion has weight beyond itself, even silence can be interpreted in ways that were never intended, so people learn to speak less freely, to choose words more carefully, to reveal only what feels safe. And over time, that becomes normal. The conversation ends naturally, without closure, without tension, just completion. The figure steps back and leaves you alone near the window. You look down into the courtyard, people moving below, patterns forming, interactions unfolding, none of them aware of how closely everything is connected, or how fragile those connections can be. You stand there for a while, not thinking of betrayal, not thinking of loyalty, but of something more subtle. How difficult it is to know what is real. When everything is filtered through caution, a soft breeze moves through the corridor, carrying distant sound, faint, unclear, like something almost understood, but never fully heard. And in that moment, you realize something that does not leave easily. In a place where everyone watches each other carefully, even trust becomes a performance. There is a moment in every ruler's day when decisions stop being solitary and become shared, not equally, but carefully. Today begins in one of the deeper halls of the palace. A space designed not for display, but for gathering. The ceiling is high, but not overwhelming. The light is softer here, filtered through narrow openings above that let in only controlled portions of the sky. Everything feels balanced, measured, intentional. You arrive before most of them. As always, the room is still forming itself when you enter. Scrolls are being placed, chairs adjusted slightly, footsteps echoing briefly before settling into silence, and then they arrive, one by one. Advisors, senators, officials, each entering with a practiced sense of timing. None rush, none hesitate. They understand the rhythm of this space. You do not stand immediately, and neither do they begin speaking right away. There is a quiet order to everything here. Even before words are spoken, eventually, the room settles, and then it begins. A discussion unfolds, not loud, not chaotic, but led, each voice building carefully on the last. Or sometimes subtly correcting it. You listen, not just to the words, but to the structure beneath them, because nothing here is ever just a statement. It is positioning, a suggestion, a framing, a direction disguised as neutrality. One advisor speaks of grain supplies from distant regions, another responds with concerns about transport delays, a third introduces a possibility framed as caution, but carrying deeper implications. You notice how no one directly contradicts another. Instead, they bend around disagreement, shaping conflict into something acceptable, something survivable. Your gaze moves slowly across the room. Each face is calm, composed, but not identical. Some speak with confidence that is carefully rehearsed, others with hesitation disguised as humility, and a few remain mostly silent. Choosing moments with precision, you begin to understand something subtle. Power here is not just in speaking, it is in knowing when not to. A scroll is brought forward, then another. The room reacts to each one differently, but quietly. No visible tension, only shifts in attention, like a tide moving beneath still water. You allow the discussion to continue without interruption, because interruption changes everything. It breaks flow, alters perception, and here. Perception is often more important than resolution. A senator steps forward, he speaks carefully, his words are structured. Almost poetic in their restraint, he does not challenge directly, instead. He suggests perspective, a different way of seeing the issue. You listen, and in his tone, you detect something familiar, not defiance, not obedience, but calculation. He is not trying to oppose, he is trying to be remembered correctly. Another voice follows, then another. The conversation becomes a layered structure of thought, each layer shaped by the awareness that you are present. Listening, evaluating, absorbing. Even silence becomes part of their communication. At one point, the room pauses, not because it is over, but because something unspoken has reached its limit. A decision is needed. The air tightens slightly, not visibly, but collectively felt. All attention subtly shifts toward you. This is the moment they were guiding toward. Without ever saying it directly, you finally speak, not at length, not dramatically, just enough, a sentence. Calm and controlled, it lands in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and immediately everything adjusts. Some nod slightly, some lower their gaze, some simply accept it without visible reaction, but all of them now move forward from it. The discussion continues briefly, but now in a different direction, aligned, settled, decided. You realize something as you observe them. These men are not simply advisors, they are filters, transforming chaos into structure, uncertainty into something that feels manageable. But they are also something else. They are mirrors, reflecting back not just information, but the way power is expected to be received. After a while, the meeting dissolves naturally, no formal ending, just a gradual dispersal, like mist fading from a room. You remain seated for a moment longer. The hall slowly empties, footsteps fade, scrolls are gathered, voices disappear into corridors beyond, and silence returns. But it is not the same silence as before. It is shaped now, structured, carrying the echo of many voices that passed through it. You look at the empty space where they once stood, and you understand something quietly important. They do not simply advise you, they interpret the empire for you, and in doing so, they also interpret you for the empire, a loop that never fully closes. As you stand and begin to leave the hall, the weight of that realization lingers, because leadership here is not only about deciding, it is about being translated constantly by those around you, and you begin to wonder, in a place where everything is interpreted, how much of anything remains truly direct. There is a different kind of silence that exists outside the palace walls. It is not the silence of empty corridors or marble halls waiting for movement. It is a silence that is filled with eyes, thousands of them, waiting, watching, expecting. Today, you are not inside the inner chambers. You are moving toward the public spaces of Rome, where the empire becomes visible, where power is no longer quiet, but seen. The procession begins before you even arrive, not with noise, but with preparation. People are already in place long before you appear. Streets cleared, pathways arranged, guards positioned with precise spacing, forming invisible boundaries that guide everything without needing to be spoken. The city feels different here, less controlled from within, more controlled from above. As you step forward, the world changes subtly, voices lower, movement slows. Even the air feels attentive, not because it understands you, but because it has learned what happens when it doesn't. You do not move quickly, you never do. Every step carries awareness, not of speed, but of presence. Ahead, the streets open into a broad public square, and there it is, the crowd. It is not chaotic, not uncontrolled, it is arranged in its own natural order. Shaped by anticipation rather than force, people stand shoulder to shoulder, yet each one seems aware of space, of distance, of position. You notice faces, some filled with admiration, some neutral, some unreadable, and some carefully hidden beneath expression, because in a crowd like this, emotion becomes visible currency, and not everyone wishes to spend it openly. As you move forward, the sound begins to rise, not all at once, but gradually, a wave forming in pieces, voices calling your title, greetings, requests disguised as blessings, blessings disguised as hope. It all blends together into something that feels both unified and fragmented. You acknowledge nothing directly, you simply continue, because that is what is expected, an expectation. Here is its own language. A raised platform comes into view. Marble steps leading upward, simple in design, but elevated enough to separate you from the crowd without walls. You ascend slowly, each step deliberate, each movement observed. From above, the city feels different again, not larger, but more distant. You turn, and now the crowd is fully visible, a living surface stretching outward in every direction, and for a brief moment, everything is still, not silent, but paused, waiting for you to become what they have gathered to see. You begin to speak. Not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly, each word carried outward by trained messengers positioned around the square. You notice how the crowd reacts not just to meaning, but to tone, to rhythm, to certainty. Even when they do not fully understand what is being said, you realize something quietly important. Public presence is not about explanation, it is about stability. People are not always listening for information, they are listening for reassurance, for structure, for the feeling that the world remains aligned. As you continue, reactions ripple through the crowd, small shifts, subtle nods, quiet exchanges between those standing nearby, but nothing breaks the overall stillness, because no one wants to disrupt the moment, not even by accident. At the edge of the square, you notice a group of officials watching carefully, not the crowd, but you. Their attention is not emotional. It is analytical, measuring response, recording reaction, noting what cannot be written directly. You finish speaking, a pause follows, longer than expected, not uncomfortable, but charged. Then slowly, the sound returns, not sudden applause, but gradual recognition, like something settling into place. You remain on the platform for a moment longer, looking out, not at individuals, but at the idea of them, because that is what public appearances become, not interaction, but perception, a controlled meeting point between expectation and reality. As you descend the steps, the crowd begins to disperse, not quickly, not chaotically, but naturally. As if the moment has completed its purpose, you walk back through the cleared streets, the city slowly returning to itself, but something remains behind, not visible, not spoken, just a shared memory of presence. And as you return toward the palace, you begin to understand something quietly unsettling. The emperor is not only someone who rules, he is someone who must be seen ruling, and without that visibility, power begins to feel like it is fading into silence. There is a feeling that begins to grow over time, not loud, not immediate, but constant, the sense that you are never truly unobserved, even in silence, even alone, especially alone. The palace is quiet this morning, but it is not empty. It never is. You walk through a corridor where the light feels softer than usual. Not brighter, not darker, just present in a way that makes everything feel slightly more exposed, as if the walls themselves are paying attention. A servant passes at a distance. They lower their gaze instantly. Their movement is smooth, practiced, almost automatic, but you notice something in the timing, a fraction of hesitation before they step aside, a moment where awareness sharpens. Not fear alone, something more layered. You continue walking, guards stand at intervals along the corridor. Still, silent, watching outward, but also inward, in ways that are less visible. They are not looking directly at you, they never do for too long, but their presence creates something undeniable, a structure of observation that surrounds every path you take. You reach a broader hall, windows line one side, revealing a partial view of the city beyond. Life moves outside in its usual rhythm. Unaware of the quiet complexity happening within these walls, but here, inside, everything feels measured, even movement feels like it has been arranged in advance. You notice a group of scribes seated near a table. They are not speaking much, they are writing, carefully, consistently, scroll after scroll, records of decisions, observations, reports. Small fragments of moments that will later become something larger, history. Assembled in real time, one of them glances up briefly as you pass, then returns to writing immediately. But the pause was enough. You realize something quietly unsettling. Even when you are not present in a room, you are still being recorded, interpreted, preserved. The palace does not only serve you in the present, it builds a version of you for the future. You pass through another section, more advisors here, but quieter than before. They are not in formal discussion. Instead, they are reading, comparing notes, exchanging low remarks that end quickly when you draw near. There is no dramatic silence when you enter, only adjustment, subtle realignment, as if the room itself shifts its shape slightly around your presence. You pause near a column, and for a moment, you do nothing. Just observe, and in that observation, something becomes clearer. People are not only watching you when you speak or act, they are watching what you might do, even in stillness. You are a subject of interpretation. A decision not yet made becomes its own form of influence. You move again, deeper into the palace. The corridors grow quieter, less populated, but not less aware. There are spaces here where conversations happen without words. A glance exchanged between two officials, a slight movement of posture when you pass, a scroll held a little tighter than necessary. Everything carries meaning, even when it pretends not to. You stop near an open archway that leads into a courtyard. From here, you can see a fountain at its center. Water moves steadily, unchanged, unaffected by everything happening around it. For a moment, it feels like contrast, something natural inside something constructed. But even that thought fades quickly, because you notice them, at the edges of the courtyard, not guards, not servants, observers, men and women positioned in quiet stillness. Not openly identified. Not formally introduced, they do not draw attention, but they are watching, not just you, everything. You understand, slowly, that the empire does not rely only on what is spoken in rooms of power, it also relies on what is seen elsewhere, and what is remembered, and what is passed along without being written at all. The empire has many eyes, some official, some invisible, some that belong to people you will never directly meet. You continue walking, but the awareness does not leave. It follows, not as a presence you can confront, but as a condition you cannot escape. Every space you enter feels slightly different once you realize it. Every silence becomes layered, every interaction doubled in meaning. Even your own thoughts begin to feel less private, as if they too exist within reach of interpretation. You reach a quieter chamber, empty except for stone benches and soft light entering from above. You sit for a moment, not because you need rest, but because stillness here feels different, heavier, more aware of itself, and in that stillness, a thought forms clearly. The empire does not only exist because it is ruled, it exists because it is observed. Constantly, by everyone, and by no one in particular. You rise again, and as you do, you understand something that does not fade easily. To be emperor is not only to be followed, it is to be seen from every direction at once, even when you are not looking. There is a strange contradiction at the heart of protection. The closer it becomes, the more you begin to feel its weight. You walk today surrounded by guards. As always, they are never far, never absent, never truly out of sight, not because danger is visible, but because it is always assumed. The corridors are wider here, closer to the outer sections of the palace. The architecture feels more exposed, though still carefully controlled. Light enters from multiple angles, casting soft layers of shadow across stone floors, and everywhere you move, they move with you, or not ahead. Not behind, around, a shifting perimeter of discipline and silence, armor reflects faint light as they adjust their positions with subtle precision. No unnecessary motion. No wasted sound, they are trained for stillness as much as action. You pass through a gate-like passage where the structure narrows briefly. The guards tighten formation without being told. It is not dramatic, it is instinctive, a language without speech. You notice how even the sound of footsteps changes here, heavier, more deliberate, as if the palace itself understands where vulnerability might exist, but you are not told where that is. You are only protected from it. A commander steps slightly closer than the others, not speaking, just present. You recognize the pattern. Certain individuals remain near you not because they are assigned randomly, but because they are trusted to remain close. Trusted, a word that feels different here, because trust in this context is not emotional, it is procedural, measured. Audited, you continue forward into an open walkway that overlooks part of the city walls. From here, Rome stretches outward, alive. Constant. Unaware of the calculations happening above it, for a brief moment, the distance feels strange, not physical, conceptual, because you are separated from the city not only by height, but by layers of protection that exist in both directions, to keep threats out, and to keep you in. A faint breeze moves through the walkway. Some of the guards shift slightly, always aware. Always adjusting. You realize something subtle. They are not relaxed even when nothing is happening, because their world is built around the possibility that something might. You stop near the edge. The guards stop too, instantly, without hesitation. They do not crowd you, but they do not drift either. They remain exactly where they should be, at the boundary between presence and absence. Below, the city continues its movement. Markets. Roads. People, life that does not require constant interpretation, life that does not pause when someone enters a room. You almost envy that simplicity. Almost. A senior guard speaks quietly to another nearby. Not about you. Not directly, but their tone is low, controlled, brief, then silence returns immediately. You begin to notice how silence is never empty here. It is structured, maintained. Even the absence of speech has discipline. As you continue walking, you pass through a more enclosed section again. The architecture tightens. Walls closer. Sightlines narrower. Protection increases, and so does awareness. You feel it in the way guards reposition slightly as you turn corners, in the way their spacing adjusts without instruction, in the way they never allow themselves to fall into pattern too predictable, because predictability is a vulnerability, and vulnerability is something the palace refuses to acknowledge openly. A corridor opens into a small inner chamber used as a temporary resting point for guards during rotation. They stand aside as you pass. No one sits when you are near, even if permitted. They do not. You do not ask them to stop, but you notice the effort it takes to remain constantly prepared, always alert, always ready for a moment that may never come. And that is when something shifts in your understanding. Protection is not only safety, it is also expectation. The expectation that something could go wrong at any moment, and so nothing is ever fully allowed to settle. You move again, deeper, toward the center, and the guards follow, not out of fear of you, but out of duty toward something that exists beyond both you and them, the idea of continuity, of stability, of an empire that must not be interrupted. As you walk, the sound of armor becomes almost rhythmic, not loud, not sharp, but constant enough to be noticed only when you focus on it, a reminder that you are never unaccompanied, even in thought. Eventually, you pause again in a quieter section. The guards stop with you, perfectly aligned. You look at them for a moment, and what you see is not tension, not aggression, but restraint, a carefully controlled readiness that never fully relaxes. And you understand something quietly unsettling. They are not only protecting you from the outside world, they are also shaping how you experience it, filtering reality, maintaining distance, ensuring that nothing reaches you unprocessed, and in that realization, you begin to see protection differently. There are moments in the palace when time feels heavier than usual, not because it slows down, but because it becomes visible in consequences. You sit once again in a chamber designed for decisions, not display, not ceremony, just outcome. The room is quieter than the others you have passed through before. The kind of quiet that does not feel empty, but compressed. Like sound itself has learned restraint here. A long table stretches across the center of the space. Stone. Polished. Simple in design, but worn slightly at the edges from years of use. On it, scrolls are arranged, not randomly, but in order of urgency. Each one represents something beyond its surface, a region, a supply line, a dispute, a request, a warning, small pieces of a much larger structure that never fully reveals itself at once. You do not open the first scroll immediately. Instead, you look at it, because experience has taught you something subtle. Reading is not the beginning of understanding, it is the continuation of what others have already begun shaping. An official stands at the far side of the room, waiting, not impatient, not anxious, just prepared. You gesture slightly, and the process begins. The first matter is presented, a delay in movement of resources across distant provinces. On its surface, it is logistical, but as details unfold, you begin to see the layers beneath it. Local decisions, regional tensions, small misalignments that have grown slowly over time. Nothing immediate, nothing dramatic, but connected, always connected. Another scroll is opened. This one concerns a disagreement between local authorities. The language used to describe it is careful, almost softened. Because even in documentation, tone matters. You listen as the explanation is given, but you are not only hearing what is said, you are also noticing what is absent. Certain names are emphasized, others are blurred, motives are implied rather than stated. It is not misinformation, it is interpretation, and interpretation, you realize again, is unavoidable. A third matter follows, then a fourth, each one adding another layer to the room. Not noise, but weight. You begin to notice something subtle in the rhythm of it all. Every decision feels isolated while being deeply connected, like separate threads of a single fabric that only reveals its full shape when pulled tight enough. The officials speak when necessary, but never more than necessary. They understand your attention is not something to be wasted or tested. A pause settles after one explanation ends, not formal, but natural. In that pause, you look at the map laid across the table. It is large, detailed, markings across regions that stretch far beyond this room, places you may never see directly, but still influence through every choice made here. You realize something quietly unsettling. You are not deciding for individuals in isolation. You are deciding for systems, for patterns, for chains of cause and effect that extend far beyond immediate visibility. A single adjustment in one region alters movement elsewhere. A delay here creates pressure there. A correction intended to stabilize one area can introduce strain in another. Nothing exists alone, and yet every decision must be made as if it does. The room remains still as another matter is presented. This one carries more urgency, not louder, not more dramatic, just more immediate in implication. You listen carefully, and for a moment, the room feels like it narrows, not physically, but conceptually, as if the space between action and consequence has shortened. You ask a question. The response is given after a brief pause, measured, careful, complete enough to satisfy structure, but still leaving room for uncertainty. That is always the case. You realize that certainty is rarely offered here, only informed direction. Eventually, you speak. Your voice is calm, even, final in tone, and once spoken, the decision settles into the room like something irreversible finding its place. there is no reaction that is too large, only adjustment. People begin to move differently. Notes are made, plans shift, the system absorbs the decision quietly. Without resistance, that is when it becomes clear, the empire does not respond to decisions, it adapts to them. You lean slightly back in your seat, not out of relief, but awareness, because each decision you make does not end here, it begins elsewhere, in ways that will unfold without your direct observation, and that is the part that remains with you, not the act itself, but its distance, the separation between cause and outcome. You stand slowly, the officials remain in place. Until you move first, a rule that is never spoken, but always followed. As you leave the chamber, the scrolls remain behind you. Still. Waiting. Ready for the next moment of interpretation, and as the doors close softly, you understand something that does not leave easily. To rule here is not to decide what happens in front of you, it is to accept responsibility for what happens far beyond your sight, and sometimes, long after you have already moved on. There is a kind of silence that does not come from empty rooms, but from full ones. You notice it more now, not because anything has changed dramatically, but because you have begun to hear it differently. The palace is active today, people move. Speak. Coordinate. Adjust, and yet, none of it reaches you in the way it once might have. You walk through a long interior passage where light falls in soft strips across the marble floor. The rhythm of your steps is steady, but everything around you feels slightly removed, as if the world is happening one layer away from where you stand. An advisor walks beside you for a short distance, speaking, explaining something that requires attention. Their voice is clear, controlled, structured, but as you listen, you realize something subtle. You are hearing the words, but not the weight behind them, not fully, because the weight of everything has begun to collect elsewhere, in you, and not around you. You respond when necessary, short, precise, calm, and the advisor nods, not surprised, not relieved, simply aligned again with the flow of expectation. Then they fall slightly behind, not by instruction, by instinct, distance re-establishing itself without effort. You continue alone for a while, not because you are meant to be alone, but because others have learned when to step away. The corridor opens into a larger hall. It is not empty, far from it. Officials are present. Guards. Messengers. Attendants moving through overlapping tasks, but as you enter, the space subtly reorganizes, not physically. Socially, conversations lower. Movements adjust. Attention disperses and concentrates at the same time. You are surrounded, and still. Separate, a servant passes near you carrying a tray. They slow slightly, not stopping, not hesitating too visibly, just enough to acknowledge your presence in a way that does not interrupt the structure of their task, and then they move on, as if nothing changed, but everything has. You realize something that has been forming quietly over time. People do not approach you anymore with spontaneity, they approach with preparation. Even casual interactions are filtered through awareness of what you represent, and that awareness creates distance. Invisible, constant, unavoidable, you enter a quieter section of the palace again, one of those spaces designed not for audience or ceremony, but for transition, a place where decisions pass through before becoming action. There is a bench along the wall. You sit, not because you are tired, but because standing feels no different here. A group of advisors stands at a respectful distance. They are speaking among themselves, low voices. Careful phrasing, but when one of them notices you watching, their tone shifts immediately, not dramatically, just slightly, enough to remain safe. You look away, and the conversation resumes its original shape. You begin to understand something that does not fully form into words at first. It is not that people are hiding things from you, it is that everything is adjusted in your presence. Even truth becomes cautious, even honesty becomes structured, not because they distrust you, but because the space around you does not allow anything unfiltered to remain stable for long. You stand again and continue walking, through another corridor, then another. The palace is familiar now in a way that removes surprise but replaces it with something else, recognition without comfort. You pass a doorway where laughter is faintly heard inside a side chamber. It stops almost immediately as you draw near, not out of fear, but out of alignment, as if your presence resets the atmosphere. You do not enter, you continue, and as you move, you begin to notice the absence of something you once did not think about, unobserved presence, the ability for someone to exist near you without adjustment, that has slowly disappeared, not suddenly, but completely. Eventually, you find yourself in a smaller open space, a courtyard partially enclosed by stone arches. Soft light filters in, the air is still, you stand there for a moment, no one approaches immediately, and in that small gap of space, something unusual appears, not freedom, not peace, but clarity, because without interaction, without adjustment, without reaction, the silence feels different again, and in that difference, you understand something quietly difficult. Leadership does not only isolate you through power, it isolates you through awareness, the awareness that every connection is shaped by what you are, and what you are cannot be removed from the room. Even when you say nothing, even when you do nothing, even when you are simply present, you are still the center around which everything adjusts. And that center is a very quiet place to stand. The palace does not always reveal its tension through sound. Sometimes, it reveals it through timing. You notice it today almost immediately, not in what is said, but in when it is said. The morning begins like any other. Calm corridors. Soft light. The steady rhythm of movement through marble halls that have already become familiar in their silence, but something feels slightly misaligned, subtle, like a conversation that pauses one breath too long before continuing. You walk into a gathering space where several officials are already present. They stand in small clusters, not together, not apart, but arranged in a way that feels intentional. As you enter, the room adjusts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in layers, a shift in posture here. A lowered voice there. A glance that disappears before it can settle. You take your place without interruption, and the discussion begins. At first, it is ordinary reports, updates, routine matters, but beneath the surface, something else moves. You hear it in the phrasing, in the careful selection of words. Certain topics are approached indirectly, others are avoided entirely until someone else brings them forward. There is no disagreement spoken openly, but there is something else, a tension that exists between sentences rather than within them. You notice how one official waits just a fraction longer before responding to another. How a suggestion is repeated slightly differently by a second voice. As if reshaped before being accepted. It is not conflict. Not yet, but it is not harmony either. It is something in between. You remain silent for a while, observing, listening not only to what is said, but to how the room behaves around what is said. A scroll is placed on the table, then another. The topic shifts, but the atmosphere does not soften. Instead, it tightens, like fabric slowly pulled from multiple directions. You can feel it now. The court is not unified in its thinking. It never truly is, but today, the differences are closer to the surface than usual, still unspoken, still controlled, but present. One advisor speaks carefully, proposing a direction. Another responds not by opposing it directly, but by introducing uncertainty. A small hesitation disguised as caution. A third adds information that reframes the suggestion entirely, and with each contribution, the shape of the discussion changes, not breaking, but bending. You begin to understand something important. Power here is not only expressed through authority, it is expressed through influence over interpretation. What something means depends on who frames it last. You let the discussion continue. Not because you are passive, but because you are watching how it evolves on its own, and in doing so, you see the hidden structure beneath it, the alliances that are not spoken, the disagreements that are carefully contained, the agreements that are conditional rather than absolute. No one is fully aligned, but no one is openly divided. It is a balance held together not by agreement, but by restraint. Eventually, the conversation reaches a point where it cannot proceed further without direction. The room slows, not in silence, but in expectation. You feel it immediately, the shift toward you. Not pressure, not demand, but orientation, everything subtly turning to await structure. You speak, calmly, briefly, not resolving everything, but defining the direction, and that is enough. The room responds instantly, not with enthusiasm, not with resistance, but with adjustment, like water settling into a new shape after a stone has been dropped into it. As voices resume, the tone changes, smoother now, aligned. But you can still feel what was there before. It has not disappeared, only been redirected. The meeting eventually dissolves, naturally, without conclusion, just transition. People begin to leave in small intervals, no rush, no final gesture, only departure. You remain for a moment longer, looking at the space they occupied, and what lingers is not their presence, but the awareness that beneath every coordinated discussion, there are currents moving in different directions, some visible only in brief pauses, some hidden entirely within politeness, and some only detectable when everything else is still. As you stand and prepare to leave, you realize something quietly unsettling. The court does not break easily, but it is never truly still. It only appears that way when all tensions are held just below the surface, waiting, always waiting. In the palace, not everything is spoken aloud. Some things travel in other ways, a glance that lingers too long, a sentence left unfinished, a pause that feels heavier than it should, and from these small fragments, something begins to form. You feel it before you hear it. The shift in atmosphere, the way conversation subtly pause as you enter certain spaces, then resume as if nothing happened, but slightly differently, always slightly differently. Today, the palace feels divided into layers. On the surface, everything appears orderly. Officials move through their duties. Servants carry messages. Guards maintain their silent positions along corridors that seem unchanged from yesterday. But beneath that surface, something circulates. You walk through a long passage where two attendants are speaking softly near a window. They stop immediately when they notice you. Not abruptly, not in panic, but in practiced disappearance. One bow, one step back, and then silence. You continue forward without comment, but the silence they leave behind feels intentional, as if something was placed there in their absence. Further along, you pass a group of advisors. They are not discussing openly, they are listening to something not fully present in the room. A rumor does not need to be spoken loudly here, it only needs repetition, and distance, and time. You begin to notice how quickly information changes shape as it moves. A report becomes a suggestion becomes speculation becomes something almost accepted, even without confirmation, and yet no one takes responsibility for its origin, because origins are difficult to trace, and even more difficult to defend. You pause near an open archway overlooking a smaller courtyard. Below, a few servants move quietly between tasks. One of them looks up briefly, sees you, and immediately lowers their gaze, but not before something passes through that moment. Not fear, or not curiosity, something closer to awareness, as if even brief recognition carries consequences. You continue walking, and as you do, you begin to sense it more clearly. The palace is full of unfinished sentences, ideas that begin in one room and end nowhere in particular. Instead, they spread, quietly, through corridors, through conversations that never acknowledge their source. A senior official passes you. Their expression is composed, controlled, but something about their timing feels off, as if they are moving in response to something you have not yet been told. You do not stop them, because stopping them would require acknowledging what has not been said, and here, acknowledgement gives form to uncertainty. You reach a quieter section of the palace, less movement, fewer voices, but not less presence. Presence here is different. It does not announce itself, it accumulates. You notice two figures standing near a column, not speaking, just waiting, not for anything in particular, but for something to resolve itself. They notice you and subtly shift their stance, not enough to be obvious, but enough to indicate awareness. You pass them, and in that brief moment, you realize something important. Rumor is not just information. It is structure without authorship. It organizes perception without ever becoming fact, and because it has no clear source, it cannot be fully stopped, only observed. You think back to earlier conversations, to moments that felt slightly unclear, slightly misaligned, and you begin to understand how easily certainty can be replaced by repetition, not through force, but through presence. You stop briefly in a side corridor. No one is speaking here, but the silence feels active, as if it is holding multiple versions of the same idea at once, unconfirmed, unverified, unfinished, and yet influential. You exhale slowly, and continue walking, because in a place like this, uncertainty does not wait for resolution. It continues moving, quietly, always. Control is often imagined as something firm, something solid, something certain, but here it feels more like something you are constantly maintaining, not holding, maintaining, like balance that never fully settles. You move through the palace today with a different awareness, not because anything has changed visibly, but because you have begun to notice how much effort it takes for everything to remain as it is. The corridors are familiar now. The marble, the gold accents, the long, structured spaces where sound behaves differently depending on who enters. But today, even familiarity feels active, as if the palace is not simply existing, but being kept in place. You pass a group of officials reviewing documents near a tall window. Their voices are low, carefully spaced, not because they are afraid, but because they understand rhythm. Too fast becomes careless, too slow becomes suspicious. Everything is measured. Even thought, when spoken, must obey timing. You continue walking, and as you do, you begin to notice something subtle in how people react to your movement. Not fear exactly, not comfort either, adjustment. A continuous recalibration of behavior that happens without instruction, a step slightly to the side, a sentence slightly softened, a decision slightly delayed until your presence has passed. It is not visible as a system, but it functions like one. You reach a chamber where maps are displayed across a wide stone surface, not decorative, operational, lines, regions, markings that represent movement and structure far beyond the palace itself. You stand for a moment and look at it, and what becomes clear is not just scale, but dependence. Everything outside this room depends on decisions made within it. And yet everything within this room depends on information that arrives from outside it, a cycle that never fully closes. An advisor begins speaking, carefully, explaining conditions in a distant region, but you notice how the explanation is shaped, not distorted, but arranged, certain details placed first, others delayed, some emphasized through repetition. Meaning is not removed, it is structured. You listen without interrupting, because interruption changes the flow of how reality is being presented to you, and in a system like this, flow matters as much as content. Another official adds information, then another. Each contribution builds upon the last, not correcting, not opposing, but refining. You realize that control here is not about forcing outcomes, it is about guiding interpretation until outcomes feel natural. You speak eventually, not at length, just enough to define direction, and immediately, the room responds, not dramatically, but collectively. As if a shared structure has shifted slightly and everyone has adjusted their position within it. You notice something again. Control is not loud, it is responsive. It requires constant awareness of what might shift if even one element moves incorrectly. As the discussion settles, the officials begin to disperse the materials. Scrolls gathered, maps adjusted, notes reorganized, order restored. but not in a final sense, only temporarily, because you understand now that nothing here remains stable on its own. It is stabilized, continuously, by people, by processes, by attention. You step away from the table, and for a moment, you are alone in the chamber. The space feels different, without motion, not empty, just unfinished, as if everything in it is still waiting to be confirmed. You think about what it means to control something this large, not just to direct it, but to keep it from drifting into uncertainty, and slowly, a realization settles in: control is not a state. It is a continuous effort against collapse. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual drift into inconsistency, into misalignment, into misunderstanding. You leave the chamber, and as the doors close behind you, the sound is soft, almost imperceptible, but it marks something important: a transition back into motion, back into maintenance, back into the quiet responsibility of keeping everything aligned, even when nothing appears to be falling apart. There are rare moments in the palace when everything slows down just enough to feel different, not stopped, not paused, just softened. You find yourself in one of those spaces now, a smaller chamber, away from the constant movement of officials and messengers. The architecture here is still grand, still carefully designed, but less overwhelming. The walls do not press in with expectation. The air does not feel immediately filled with purpose, for a brief moment. It is only a room. You stand near a tall window. Outside, the light is softer than usual. It spreads gently across distant rooftops and courtyards, touching stone and greenery in a way that feels almost indifferent to what happens inside these walls. There is no speech here, no decisions being made, no one waiting for instruction, and that absence feels unusual, because you have grown used to presence in every direction. Even silence, in most parts of the palace, has structure, but here it loosens slightly. You place a hand against the cool stone of the window frame. It is steady, unchanging, unlike everything it overlooks. Your mind drifts without direction at first, not toward problems, not toward responsibilities, but toward the simple awareness of movement. How everything in the palace is always transitioning from one state to another. A message becomes a decision becomes action. Action becomes consequence. And then it circles back again, a continuous cycle that rarely allows pause. You notice your own breathing more clearly now, not because it is different, but because you are finally still enough to observe it without interruption. A servant passes quietly outside the chamber. They do not enter. They do not stop, but their presence briefly reminds you that stillness here is always relative. Nothing is ever fully separated from function. Even quiet moments exist within structure. You turn slightly away from the window. The room behind you is simple compared to the others you have occupied today. Fewer decorations, less movement, more space, and in that space, something subtle begins to surface, not thought in the active sense, but awareness of everything that has been carried through the day. Conversations, decisions, adjustments, interpretations, each one layered over the next without fully disappearing. You begin to understand that the mind, in a place like this, rarely empties. It accumulates, even when nothing is happening externally. You sit slowly on a stone bench near the center of the chamber, not because you are tired, but because sitting changes the perspective of the room, from authority to observation, from participation to reflection. The silence here is different from the silence of council chambers or guarded corridors. It does not expect response, it does not hold tension. It simply exists, and in that existence, thoughts begin to settle differently, not as decisions waiting to be made, but as things that do not require immediate resolution. That in itself feels unfamiliar. Time passes without clear markers, no announcements, no interruptions, just gradual shifts in light across the floor. You realize how rarely the day offers this kind of space, not because it is forbidden, but because it is rarely encountered in the rhythm of everything else. You think about the structure of your role, not as responsibility alone, but as constant engagement, every moment filled before it can become empty, every silence shaped before it can remain undefined, and for a brief instant, you wonder what it would feel like if that structure were absent, not broken, just paused. But the thought does not linger, because even reflection here is temporary. The world does not stop moving, only your awareness of it softens. Eventually, you stand again. The stillness remains behind you in the chamber, unchanged, waiting, perhaps, for the next rare moment it is allowed to exist. As you step back into the corridor, the shift is immediate, sound returns, distance reappears. Purpose reasserts itself without needing to be spoken, and you continue forward, carrying the quiet with you, even as it begins to fade. There are days in the palace when even movement feels weighted, not slow, not difficult, just heavy in a way that is hard to explain. You feel it the moment you step into the main corridor this morning. The marble beneath your feet is unchanged. The architecture remains as precise as ever. Columns rise in perfect symmetry. Light filters through high openings in familiar patterns, and yet everything feels slightly denser, as if the air itself has thickened with expectation. You walk forward, and the palace responds in its usual way, subtle adjustments, voices lowering, footsteps softening, gazes shifting without meeting yours directly. But today, these reactions feel more noticeable. Less automatic, more aware of themselves. You pass through a group of officials near a tall archway. They are discussing matters quietly, but their conversation pauses just a fraction longer than usual as you approach, not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but out of something more complicated, recognition of weight, the kind that does not need to be spoken. You continue without stopping, and as you move deeper into the palace, you begin to notice how everything seems slightly more deliberate than usual. Servants carry objects with extra care, guards stand with increased stillness. Even distant conversations feel carefully contained. It is not disorder, far from it. It is control. Intensified. As if the entire structure is compensating for something unseen, you enter a wider hall where banners hang from high beams, gently moving with the faint air currents. The motion is slow, almost imperceptible, but it draws your attention more than usual, a reminder that even in stillness, there is always movement. You stop briefly near a stone pillar, not because you need to, but because the space invites pause today, and in that pause, you become more aware of something internal, not emotion in a dramatic sense, but accumulation, the layering of decisions, observations, responses, and expectations that have built up over time without ever fully leaving. It is not pressure from outside. It is something that has been carried for so long that it no longer feels separate from you. A group of messengers passes through the far end of the hall. Their pace is steady, their expressions neutral, but their timing feels precise, as if each movement has been arranged in coordination with something larger than what is visible. You watch them briefly, then continue walking. As you move, the sense of heaviness does not increase, it simply remains. Consistent, present, unchanging. In its quiet way, you begin to realize something subtle. It is not that today is more difficult than others, it is that awareness has sharpened. The same structure that once felt normal now reveals its density. Every interaction carries more awareness of consequence, every silence feels more filled, every moment slightly more significant than it appears on the surface. You pass into a more enclosed corridor, light narrows here, a sound softens, the world becomes closer, not smaller, closer. A senior official bows slightly as you pass. You acknowledge it with a small gesture, nothing more, but even that brief exchange feels like it carries additional layers today, not meaning, but weight of interpretation. You realize how many things exist simultaneously in each moment here. What is said, what is intended, what is perceived, what is remembered, and all of it coexists without ever fully aligning. Eventually, you reach a quieter space near an inner courtyard. You stop again. The courtyard beyond is still. A few trees move gently in the background. Light rests softly on stone pathways. For a moment, nothing asks anything of you, and that absence stands out more than usual. You remain there longer than expected, not resisting movement, just allowing stillness to exist without interruption, and in that stillness, something becomes clear. Power is not only defined by what it commands, it is also defined by what it carries without relief, not in bursts, but continuously. Like a presence that never fully steps away, you exhale slowly, and then continue forward, because even when power feels heavy, it does not pause, it simply moves with you. There is a point in every long silence where illusion begins to fade, not suddenly, not violently, but slowly. Like light changing direction in a room you thought you understood, you stand today in one of the deepest chambers of the palace, a place not often visited unless required. The air here is still, but not empty. It carries the residue of decisions made long before this moment. The stone feels older, heavier, as if it remembers more than it shows. There is a throne in this chamber, but it does not feel like a destination. It feels like an object that exists to be observed rather than used. You do not sit immediately. Instead, you look at it, because experience has taught you something simple. Objects of power are never just objects. They are expectations made visible. Around the chamber, there is no crowd, no advisors, no movement of officials shaping interpretation in real time, only distance, and in that distance, clarity begins to surface. You notice how quiet it is without layers of activity around you, not peaceful, not unsettling, just exposed. A servant enters briefly to adjust a candle. They do not look directly at you, or not out of fear, but out of structure. Then they leave, and the chamber returns to its still state. You walk slowly around the space. The throne remains in your peripheral vision, always present, never changing. And yet your awareness of it shifts with every step. You begin to understand something that rarely appears in conversation. The throne is not the source of power. It is the point at which power becomes visible enough to be recognized. Everything before it is preparation, everything after it is consequence. You stop near the center of the room, and for a moment, you do nothing, no decisions, no communication, no responses waiting to be shaped, just presence, and in that presence, something subtle emerges, a recognition that has been building quietly across time. The role is not separate from the person. It cannot be placed on or removed like a garment. It blends into perception itself, the way people speak before you, the way they pause when you enter, the way even silence adjusts its shape. All of it is not directed at an individual, but at what that individual represents in the minds of others. You move again, slowly approaching the throne, not with ceremony, not with hesitation, but with awareness. As you draw closer, the detail becomes clearer, not its design, but its effect. It defines space without needing to occupy it fully. It changes how the room is understood. Even when empty, you reach it and stand beside it, not above it, not beneath it, just beside it, and in that position, something unexpected becomes clear. Power is not located in a single place. It is distributed across perception, expectation, memory, and reaction. The throne is only where all of that becomes concentrated enough to be recognized. You finally sit, not dramatically, not ceremonially. Just a simple transition from standing to stillness, and in that moment, the chamber does not change, but your awareness of it does. The silence feels structured again, not empty, but arranged. As if even stillness has layers that respond to presence. You remain seated for a while, not thinking in direction, but in reflection, and slowly, a realization settles without urgency. The reality behind the throne is not grandeur, it is maintenance, continuous, invisible, unending maintenance of perception, of order, of belief. And as you sit there, you understand something quietly profound. The throne does not create power. It holds the shape of what people already believe power must look like, and without that belief, it would simply be stone. You rise again after a time, and the chamber remains unchanged, but you do not in any visible way, only in understanding. and that is often the only change that matters here. There are moments when even an empire feels like it is holding its breath, not collapsing, not rising, just waiting. You find yourself once again moving through the palace, though it no longer feels like movement in the way it once did. The corridors are familiar now in a way that no longer asks for attention. Marble, stone, light filtering through high windows. Guards positioned at distances that feel both precise and natural. Everything is in place, and that is exactly what makes it feel strange, because perfection, over time, stops feeling like achievement, and starts feeling like stillness that cannot move. You walk without urgency, not because there is nothing to do, but because everything feels already in motion without needing your participation in the same way as before. Somewhere in the distance, a faint echo of conversation passes through another hall. A messenger moving quickly. A brief exchange of words too soft to fully catch, and then it is gone, like most things here, temporary, but recorded somewhere nonetheless. You realize now that the palace is never truly quiet. It only distributes sound so carefully that it begins to feel like silence. You stop near a long archway overlooking an interior garden. The evening light is different now, lower, softer. It does not illuminate everything equally. Instead, it rests unevenly across surfaces, leaving parts of the world gently hidden. Trees move slightly in the breeze. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to remind you that something beyond structure continues to exist without instruction. For a long moment, you remain there, not observing anything specific, just existing within the frame of it. And as you do, your thoughts begin to loosen in a way that does not feel forced, not reflection, not analysis, something quieter, a slow unthreading of everything that has been held together throughout the day. You think about the court, not as a place, but as a mechanism, always adjusting, always responding, always interpreting. You think about the people who move through it, the careful language, the silent negotiations, the way certainty is rarely spoken directly, but instead built through layers of suggestion and restraint. And you think about yourself, not as a title, but as a point where all of that converges, where interpretation gathers and becomes action, where distance between decision and consequence stretches further than sight can follow. A soft wind passes through the archway. The garden below shifts slightly in response. Nothing dramatic, nothing noticeable unless you are still enough to see it. You realize how rare stillness truly is here, not physical stillness, but mental, the kind that does not immediately transform every moment into responsibility. You close your eyes briefly, and for the first time in a long while, there is no immediate structure to your thoughts, no chamber waiting, no council forming, no decision already shaping itself in advance, just awareness, simple, unlayered. It lasts only a moment, but it is enough to reveal how much of your inner world has been shaped by constant presence of expectation. You open your eyes again. The garden is unchanged, but something in how you see it has softened, as if distance has quietly increased between you and everything that normally demands interpretation. You begin walking again, slowly, through another corridor that leads away from the open space. The palace continues its rhythm around you, servants passing at intervals, guards maintaining positions, officials moving between unseen responsibilities, each part functioning as though the system itself is breathing through them. You notice now how little resistance there is anywhere, not because everything agrees, but because everything adapts. An adaptation, over time, begins to resemble stability. You pass a doorway where light spills into the corridor from a chamber within. Voices are faint inside, not urgent, not ceremonial, just human. You do not enter, you simply continue, and in that continuation, something begins to settle within you. Not realization in the dramatic sense, but acceptance of scale, of distance, of how large systems do not move because of single moments, but because of accumulated continuity. You stop again in a quieter section of the palace. There is no one immediately nearby. Only architecture, stone that has witnessed countless versions of the same structure of life unfolding within it, and you understand something that does not feel new, but finally clear. The empire is not held together by control alone, it is held together by repetition, by countless small decisions made every day without collapse, by interpretations that align just enough to prevent fracture. By silence that carries meaning without needing to declare it. You stand there for a while. Not as ruler, not as symbol, but as someone briefly outside the immediate flow of action, and in that space, you begin to feel the weight of time itself, not as pressure, but as accumulation. Everything continuing forward without pause, even this moment, even this understanding. Eventually, you begin walking again, toward where the palace fades into quieter corridors. Not an ending, not a conclusion, just transition into another layer of the same world, and as you move, you realize something gentle but final. History is not something that happens all at once, it is something that drifts, slowly, quietly, carried forward by people who believe they are simply continuing what already exists. The palace behind you remains alive with movement, ahead of you. Stillness returns in smaller pieces, and somewhere between those two states, you continue, not as a figure at the center of everything, but as part of the long, quiet unfolding of time itself. And now, as the light fades softly from the corridors, and the empire settles into its endless rhythm once more, there is nothing more required from this moment, only quiet continuation, only breath, only silence that does not ask for meaning. Good night.